go ahead and be transparent and say, that when I think about this particular report, I really think that our target audience is really sort of athletic directors, right? So it's not, necessarily, any particular field or any particular school, but in turn, we're definitely targeting our athletic directors just so they'll have this on their radar. And so again, my name's Emmett Gill. I'm with Athletes and Advocates for Social Justice in Sports. And before I begin, I want to thank our graduate level interns, Marlon, Catherine, Emma, Tiara, Yvonne, Ava, who worked on this report. It would not have been possible without their hard work, their diligence, their insight, and their intellect. And so, the first slide is what we already know, right? Mental health in college sports is a concern, in particular with regard to, the onset of COVID-19. The NCAA conducted a study of 37,000 college athletes and found that, a third of the respondents reported experiencing sleep difficulties. Another quarter reported feeling sadness and sense of loss. And I think that the third point is something that's truly concerning, and that's 1 in 10 reported feeling so depressed that it had become difficult to function most every day. And as as behavioral health and mental health providers, when we talk about reporting, we know that there's a sense, that certain populations underreport. Certainly, college and professional athletes might fall in that line when we talk about underreporting. And then mental health concerns were highest among respondents of color. And just to go back, again, for those of you who are working within college athletics, you know that, back in 2013, the NCAA started its first mental health task force, its first summit, published best practices. And then I believe it was a couple of years ago, if not a little shorter time frame, that the NCAA began to not only mandate mental health services, for college athletic departments, but also mandate that those college athletic departments provide information on mental health services. And that did not necessarily mean that the mental health services needed to be embedded in athletics, but that college athletes needed access to those mental health services. And so one caveat to our examination is that we only included schools who had mental health services or behavioral health services embedded in athletics. Just a quick overview when we talk about race and mental health providers, but first talk about sort of a national scope, right? So when we talk about, behavioral health providers, social workers make up about 12% of all social workers nationally are Hispanic. About 60.6% are white, and about 21.5% are Black, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Then when we look at psychologists, about 6.3 are Hispanic, 83.5% are white, and then 4.9% are Black. So when we think racially, in terms of racial diversity, in terms of behavioral health providers, minorities make up anywhere between 11 to 32% of counselors, social workers, and psychologists, okay? But we know that from some of the research that's been conducted that race can impact provisions, it can impact rapport, it can impact help-seeking behavior, it can impact engagement and intervention. For the work of Wilkinson in 2019, looking at the mental health providers, race, and Black football players, one participant shared that race plays a part in not seeking services. And another participant expressed that it's difficult to trust certain people. Like I said, you just come from different backgrounds and you just can't trust that type of information. It is just sometimes you don't feel comfortable with trusting a person. Now, certainly this does not infer that providers who are white or Hispanic or Asian can't work with Black and brown athletes, just like Black and brown providers can work with athletes from different ethnicities, race, and gender. But it simply raises the reality that when we talk about race and gender and mental health provisions, whether it's rapport, whether it's engagement, whether it's recruiting, whether it's engagement and interventions, that race and gender can play a role. Nationally, when we look at counselors, 30.2% are male and 69.8% are female. With respect to social workers, we typically see 19 or about 20% are men and about 80% are women. Among psychologists, 29.4% are men and 70.6% are women. And then nationally, when we look at the research, one study found that clients assume that white therapists would not understand their personal minority group experiences. In another study, it suggested that the role of gender in a client-provider relationship depends on the level of the relationship between the individuals. And then lastly, a more dated study found that regardless of the gender, clients said that female therapists were more effective in forming therapeutic alliances. And so when we look at the role of gender in terms of mental health providers, and this particular study is not germane to college athletes or athletes in general, but what we find is some mixed results when we think about race, when we think about the role of gender in mental health provisions. Our study methodology was nothing to sort of write home about or write a statistic chapter about, right? And again, in general, we have spent probably about 10 months sort of collecting the data. There were 2 phases. We had an initial database last spring, and then we scrubbed that database this fall. In collaboration with the graduate students, we did come up with some methods to try and evaluate racial diversity in terms of athletic departments. One of the challenges that our research team ran into is the reality that a myriad of athletic departments have one provider. And so how do you judge on diversity when you have only one provider? And so and I'll share a little bit about that later, but our resolution was not to provide a failing grade because it would be sort of an automatic failing grade. But on the other hand, provide a passing grade with the understanding that any athletic department who's operating in college athletics right now with one provider in the Division I setting, in particular a Power 5 conference setting, is you probably have a provider who has a caseload. Let's just say if you're working with half the college athletes, of anywhere between 200 and 250 college athletes to one. And again, our target being athletic directors and, internal and external associate ADs, we want to bring concern not just to race and diversity of who you have, but increasing, the number of practitioners that you also have in your athletic department. So we didn't want to give those departments a pass, but in the same token, we did not want to provide a failing grade. And so here are some of our demographics. Right? From the Power 5 conferences, N equals 132. In terms of behavioral health or mental health providers, there was some difficulty in terms of parsing out, for example, an administrator versus a practitioner. And I'm sure that we'll receive some feedback on that and we'll make some adjustments if necessary, but that was a challenge because primarily we use athletic department staff directories, Google and LinkedIn searches and other means to verify race. But we see the overwhelming majority of practitioners are female, about 60%. We see that a large overwhelming majority of practitioners are white, 78%, or 104 out of the 132 behavioral health practitioners. 21 of those practitioners are Black, 4 are Asian. Okay, so about 16.6% are Black and about 3.6 are Asian. Of the 132, 48% are white females, 30% are white males, 8.3% are Black females, and 7.5% are Black males. Asian males and females make up 1.5% respectively. And then we also had the fortune of being able to exchange race information with one athletic department, and we were informed that their staff, in fact, included 3 biracial individuals, 2 males and 1 female. I think my concern, of course, and I've had some things that are highlighted here, but the other highlight that should be on here that's not, is that there are no Hispanic providers at any of the Power 5 conference schools, whether it be male or female. And, you know, from our work, we do know that we have Latinx males and females who are competing at the highest level of sport. So the fact that none of the providers are Hispanic is certainly of concern, along with some of the other numbers that you see here. So we go to conference level. And basically, I'm not gonna I'm not gonna talk too much to the slide. Hopefully the font is large enough so that you can be able to see it. But what you will see in the top row is that we provided a grade for each conference. In this particular case, the Big Ten scored a D in race, a B in gender, and an A in discipline. Just a little bit about the discipline. Discipline refers to, you know, sports psychology, clinical psychology, counseling psychology, social work, LPC, and all other disciplines who are involved. Because we do feel that the disciplinary perspective is important when we think about, you know, providing a robust mental health department in college athletics. You know, psychology, sports psychology, clinical and counseling psychology, they have their approach or their perspective. Social work has its perspective in terms of the person in the environment. LPCs have their perspective. You know, they're a jack of all trades and do a lot of different things well. So we believe that that's important. Just some notes on the Big Ten. Big Ten has 33 behavioral or mental health providers. The department with the greatest racial diversity included the University of Michigan. The department with the greatest gender diversity, again, the University of Michigan, along with Nebraska and Minnesota. Most diversity in terms of areas of study or discipline was Nebraska with 5. The lowest number of behavioral health practitioners was Michigan State, Northwestern, and Illinois. Another observation was that 3 Big Ten schools, Michigan, Ohio State, and Minnesota, all have a Black behavioral health practitioner. Let's move on to the SEC. Overall, the SEC was graded a C for race, a B for gender, and A for discipline. Okay. In terms of the SEC, the total number of practitioners was 32. The schools with the greatest diversity included Louisiana State and the University of Georgia. Greatest gender diversity, again, the University of Georgia and South Carolina. The highest number of behavioral health practitioners included South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana State. The highest number of Black behavioral health practitioners, Mississippi State, Louisiana, and Georgia. And I'd also like to note, kudos to the SEC with the highest number of Black practitioners with 9, which is almost half of the 21 Black practitioners overall. Other observations included the Alabama, Kentucky, Vanderbilt, and Tennessee only have 1 practitioner. All right, so let's move on to the Big 12. The Big 12 had the lowest number of behavioral health practitioners with 14, I believe. Overall, race diversity, F, gender diversity, C, disciplinary diversity, B. The greatest racial diversity was Baylor University. And Baylor University, according to our count, is the only Big 12 school. Only Big 12 with a practitioner.
Oh, you're grabbing something quick.
Somebody could
No, you're good.
Oh, you're right. The greatest gender diversity was Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. The lowest number of behavioral health practitioners, Iowa State, Kansas, Kansas State, Texas, and West Virginia, who all have 1 behavioral health practitioner. And again, Baylor had the highest number of behavioral health practitioners in the Big 12 conference. ACC. ACC scored F for race, C for gender, and an A for disciplinary diversity. I would like to note, kudos to the ACC as one of those few conferences that has sort of a formal mental health student athlete development piece that's headed by Mr. Brown. In terms of racial diversity, Clemson was the ACC school with the greatest racial diversity. In terms of gender diversity, Georgia Tech, UNC, and Virginia. In terms of the highest number of behavioral health practitioners, Virginia Tech and North Carolina State. Lowest number, Syracuse and Boston College do not have behavioral health units embedded in athletics. The number of women or female behavioral practitioners, North Carolina State. And some other observations include only 2 schools in the ACC have behavioral practitioners with social work degrees. White females are the dominant race and gender in the ACC. And there is only one, to our records, Black male behavioral health practitioner in the ACC. And we're not quite clear whether that individual is a practitioner or whether they are solely administrator. But certainly, Mr. Hollier is one of the leaders in this field. And we're so thankful to have him working with the athletes at UNC. And last but not least, the Pac-12 scored a D in terms of race diversity, an A in terms of gender diversity, and an A in terms of disciplinary diversity. And my apologies for those subject headings not being at the top of the table. Nonetheless, when we look at the Pac-12, the greatest racial diversity is at Utah, Arizona, and Oregon. We spoke of gender diversity, Colorado, as well as USC. The highest number of behavioral practitioners, USC. The highest number of Black behavioral health practitioners, Arizona, Oregon, Arizona State, and UCLA. Other observations, only 4 schools in the conference have a behavioral health practitioner with a social work degree. There are only 2 behavioral health practitioners in the conference that are not white or Black, and 82% of the behavioral health practitioners in the Pac-12 have degrees in clinical or counseling psychology. Some numbers by conferences. 92% of the behavioral health practitioners in the ACC and the Big 12 are white. 64% of the behavioral health practitioners in the Big 12 are female. 50%, kudos to the Pac-12, of the behavioral health practitioners in the Pac-12 are male. 48% of all behavioral health practitioners are white females. We spoke about that earlier. 35% of behavioral practitioners in the Big 12 are social workers. Kudos to the social workers. 33 is the total number of behavioral health practitioners of the Big 10, the highest number of all conferences. 29% of behavioral health practitioners in the SEC is Black. 29% of the behavioral health practitioners in the SEC are Black, And again, with 9, they lead all conferences by far. 12, the total number of behavioral health practitioners in the Big 12. And actually that number should be 14, so we have to make that correction. 11, the total number of Power 5 conferences, behavioral health practitioners who are Black males. 10, females. 6, the number of schools without behavioral health practitioners in athletics in those conferences include the ACC, the Big 10, and the Big 12. 4, the number of Asian behavioral health practitioners. 2, the number of Black behavioral health practitioners in the ACC. Actually, that number should be 1. The number of behavioral health practitioners in the Big 12. And again, 0, the number of Hispanic male or female behavioral health practitioners in Power 5 conferences. I promised this was going to be short because this is more of our preview for us to give folks sort of a taste of what we're trying to do, receive feedback to make sure that we're providing a report that is not only factually correct, but also, hits upon the important issues. Considerations, when we look at behavioral health in college athletics, practitioners are primarily white and they're primarily female. Psychology, counseling, and clinical are the most prevalent disciplines. The SEC is best overall, and the Big 12 and the ACC, in our opinion, are based on our research, were the worst overall in terms of gender and race diversity. Athletic departments perform much better on gender diversity than they do on racial diversity. Again, 6 athletic departments do not have counseling units embedded in athletics, which we think is a concern. Schools are doing a B+ job overall in terms of diversity and disciplines. Surprises, the lack of racial and gender diversity in the Big 12. And in terms of athletes and advocates for social justice in sports, top 3, and this is in no order: Michigan, University of Michigan, University of Georgia, and Clemson University. As a close, I just want to point out some recommendations. First of all, do we need to explore the role of implicit bias and the lack of behavioral health practitioners of color? You know, we've been talking about a lot about implicit bias, ever since the untimely and unfortunate death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. And so do we need to for us to partner with organizations like the North American Society for Sports Sociologists and the Alliance for to access qualified behavior.
Huh? I know, right? Hey.
Please.
Why are the lights not all like
Why are they not?
With the Alliance of Social Workers in Sports to access qualified behavior.
Like it makes it look dirty. Huh?
I know, right? I'm like,
To start with.
If someone who's having background, the conversation, the background,
listening to the race and gender
Yeah.
scorecard.
Yeah, is this ASPA stuff?
Yeah.
So thank you. And so the other part is the North American Society for Sports Sociologists.
Good.
This incredible international
Wrapping up until Doc's clinic.
Some
What should I, because I don't want to not respond to this woman. Should
Uh-huh.
I just tell her we're in the process of?
Yeah, I would say
Set
if you want to, I just was reading your thing while I was standing around in practice. I would just respond to her and say, hey, like Ryan's been trying to get Jill wanted to, or Dr. Jill wanted to connect, with Ryan and everyone first. Maybe you could, I don't know, have the best
Encourage her?
way to say that was, but do you have an update if she's been able to do that yet or something?
Okay.
I don't know, something along those lines, but but yeah, Estrella's, she's always really like good and responsive with us, and her role, I believe, changed this year.
Okay. She became the training director.
Yeah.
And I know from the conversation with the one trainee I had that he said she's like really excited about like that connection.
Yeah, everyone over there is like that's the frustrating part.
Yeah,
they're like, oh, this is great. Like they see.
Tyler, can you please mute yourself?
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I was trying to figure it out. I'm so sorry. Always trying to learn Zoom. Thank you for that. Whomever gave a shout out to Tyler. North American Society for Sports Sociologists is this incredible organization. And although many of them are not practitioners, they do great work in the field of sociology, sort of in understanding some of the very issues that impact our Black and Brown, Hispanic, Pacific Islander, and other minority athletes. So I think that's a great organization to partner with. The Alliance of Social Workers in Sports, I'm a member of. When we think about practitioners, in particular Black male practitioners, consistent with what we see nationally, we do have a number of Black mental health practitioners in our organization. And again, exploring licensed professional counselors as a source for Black male mental health practitioners. I know that there are several schools across conferences who employ an LPC, but I'm a big fan of just the wealth in terms of the depth of services, the toolbox, if you will, that LPCs have. Recommendations, continue, educate athletic directors about the lack of diversity, right? So when you're talking about these power conference schools, they're large, units. prior to, layoffs and furloughs, we've got, 300 and 400 member athletic departments. And so it's hard for athletic directors to see the lack of diversity, possibly. Some don't understand or value, the role of mental health in college athletics. And so it's important, either from a risk management perspective or from a trust perspective, that we really educate athletic directors. And that, at the end of the day, is the goal, is one of the goals of this report. Is not to say Black versus white or social worker versus psychologist, but really to understand that there are mixed results when we talk about the impact of race and gender on the role of mental health provisions. And so we need to be prepared, and we need to address that. Certainly we want athletes to feel comfortable that they can come and see a provider. If they want someone who looks like them or shares their same narrative, they should have that opportunity. Commit to developing an understanding of why there are no Hispanic behavioral health practitioners at Power Fives. That was really surprising to me. When we think about our revenue sports, when we think about our non-revenue sports, Latinx males and females are prevalent, and they really should, even if we, think from an international perspective, employing bilingual practitioners. That's very important. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th, 6th point, I think, is sort of important for the timeliness of our work. There are current openings at Missouri, Notre Dame, and North Carolina State, and their grades are in parentheses. And I think that this is a great time. And one of the things that we'll do as an organization is send this report to those universities and their athletic directors to let them know that this is something that they should consider. I remember Paul Horning's, famous quote, "Notre Dame needs the Black athlete." Notre Dame needs practitioners of color as well. As I close, involve conference level diversity and inclusion task forces in this conversation. I'm not sure if every conference has a task force. I'm sure of 4. But this is something that needs to be inserted into the conversation when we talk about diversity and inclusion. Certainly when we think about diversity and inclusion, and we think about the reality that we win with diversity, I think it's so important that we have this conversation about mental health professionals. Whether you're a sports psychologist, clinical or counseling, whether you're an LPC or whether you're a social worker, we inherently understand that you win with diversity.